I have a few reports here from last week I thought I would refer to. This is out of New York City. It could be any place in the country, really. First of all, a Queens man, angry that his children were crying, slapped his 2-year-old daughter and shoved his wife, prosecutors say. In that particular case, the man's name is Muhammad, and he is 27 years old. And police say he slapped his daughter. They say he slapped his daughter, who usually is at work during the day, and his wife is usually at work, and his girls are usually with their sister or at school or with their grandmother. His wife is a graduate student, and he became angry and lashed out at them. Another story here talks about another person who threw a glass baby bottle at his wife, enraged that she had left the house against his wishes during the shutdown. Another occasion here in New York City, a third occasion here, this gentleman beat his girlfriend so badly, perhaps I shouldn't call him a gentleman actually, but this man beat his girlfriend so badly he broke a bone in her face after she took too long to run an errand. Now, in this particular case, the woman, the prosecutors say that she had gone to one store and it was closed. So she had to find another store to go to. And when she returned to her Long Island apartment at 4 p.m., there was her boyfriend, visibly drunk. And according to the criminal complaint, that is, he said this. He said, "This is not physical." He said, "This is not physical," as he proceeded to beat her. He said, "If I am ever physical, you will not wake up in the morning." What a threat. Said he continued punching her in the face several times and wrapped his arms around her neck and choked her. Finally, he picked up a trash can and hit her in the face with it, and she was treated for a facial fracture, swelling, and bruising, and he is being charged with second-degree strangulation. These are some of the stories that we're hearing in the households around America as people shelter in their homes and as people are outside of their regular routines and they're around each other more. And you can imagine that this is precipitated a little bit by fear of someone being out and being out too long and coming back and being exposed to the coronavirus. Some of that probably is the case, but nonetheless, it is violence precipitated by anger. And we're seeing these stories, like I said, it's on the increase around the country. It's interesting that in New York City, they're concerned that there has been, in the city, a decrease in complaints. And they suspect that it's not because it's not happening, but it's because it's hard to get away from home. Ladies can't get to work, go to the library, or go to other places, and oftentimes they don't want to go anywhere else because they're afraid if they go to a shelter, they will be exposed to the virus. And so it's not a good thing. It's actually, they're very concerned that people are in dangerous situations and not doing anything about it because of fear of other circumstances they may expose themselves to. Well, thankfully, we in the church don't hear much of this. I'm very happy about that, but I know that we in the church have to deal with a challenge of anger. I wanted to talk about that today. Perhaps these two stories here that I'm about to read to you is more indicative of what we would experience rather than the strong violence that we see happening in so many places. True story here. Bill showed up at his therapist's office, well-dressed, but with no shoe on his right foot. He asked for help with a problem. He said that last Sunday he tried for 15 minutes to start his lawnmower. He checked the gas, he checked the spark plug and oil level, but it still wouldn't start. Finally, he was so upset he kicked the mower, and he broke 2 of his toes. Afterward, he admitted that that was a really stupid thing to do. He admitted to the counselor that he was so embarrassed about it that he really didn't tell his friends the real story. If anyone asked him about his foot, he would just say he had an accident with the mower. And he said, "I'm afraid that if I tell them the truth, they will laugh at me." He admitted to the counselor that it wasn't the first time he'd lost his temper. He says, "At times I've been pretty nasty to my wife and children, never physically abusing them, but coming close." Bill is a highly respected man. He is active in his church, but he has a problem of sometimes blowing his cool. I think this is probably a very common thing among anyone who's human. We get frustrated, and it escalates to the point that we do something stupid. We do something we regret, and oftentimes that's where anger leads. Another true story of a lady named Brooke. She's a 33-year-old mother of 2 preschoolers. She loved her husband, who was an attorney, and they have been married for 8 years. Brooke is a CPA, decided to put her career on hold to have children. She told her therapist, "I think I made a mistake. I don't think I'm cut out to be a mother. I always wanted children, but now that I've got them, I don't like the way I treat them. And I don't like what they do to me." She says, "I don't remember ever being angry or losing my temper before I had children. I always considered myself to be in control of my emotions, but I have to admit I have often lost it with my children. I hate myself when I do that, and I know that it's not good for the children." Here, a lady who, real story, real people. In this case, Brooke, she never had a problem with anger and controlling her emotions, but because of the different circumstance that she was in, and now a mother, taking care of 2 children and dealing with all that comes with that, she's finding that she has this problem. I think a lot of people are, in today's environment, things have changed. They're home more, they're around family members more often, and there's a stress there, perhaps more than usual, with the potential of sickness and the fear of what might happen. I think we are in an environment that we could find ourselves becoming angry more often. And that's really why I wanted to address the subject today, is because of the circumstances we're in. We can find ourselves more challenged than usual to deal with our emotions in a constructive way. And that could be any emotion. It could be fear, anxiety. I want to focus today on anger because it's so very destructive. It's destructive to toes when we kick mowers. It's destructive to our children. We are not to provoke our children to wrath, we are told in the Bible, and oftentimes that's done by being wrathful ourselves. And again, because of the circumstances, I think we may find ourselves becoming angry and agitated and frustrated a little easier and a little more often. If you go back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount here. In verse 21, it says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder. Whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment.' But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause, shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, 'Raca,' shall be in danger of the council. And whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be in danger of hell fire." That's interesting here. First of all, I'll just note that if you're reading an NIV translation or pretty well any other translation other than the King James or New King James, it omits "without a cause." He was angry with his brother without a cause. And that's because the Alexandrian texts omitted this. The Alexandrian texts oftentimes omit a lot of things. If you read through your center margin, you'll see that the NU, as it notes there, omits, and then it has the phrase it omits. But I think that it doesn't make sense to say whoever is angry with his brother, because we're going to see in a little while that even Christ became angry at times. And we're going to find that obviously he didn't sin. So what was that anger and how was it justified? So I believe it shouldn't indeed say without a cause. There may be a cause for righteous anger, in other words. But notice it says the word anger here, he who is angry with his brother. Obviously, we can be angry with someone without displaying it, without showing that anger, without lashing out to someone else. So we can be angry. He was angry with his brother without a cause. We may say a just cause. Will be in danger of the judgment. Whoever says to his brother, raka. Now this word raka means empty. Some translations will say empty-headed. Basically, it's like us saying, you idiot. It's calling someone empty-headed, stupid. And so it is a type of lashing out at someone and calling them a name. It says they'll be in danger of the council. And whoever says, you fool. Now, the Greek word for fool in this case is very similar to a Hebrew word as well. A Greek reader might read this and come out with the suggestion of foolishness or senselessness, similar to raka. But anyone who understood the Hebrew, it suggests moral apostasy, rebellion, and even wickedness. So even though not all commentators would agree, some consider this a kind of progression from anger to a lashing out to a really lashing out. And that is oftentimes the progression of frustration and anger. We feel it, we may say nothing, we get angrier and we lash out, and we tend to lash out more. So since Christ tells us that we have to be careful, we can be guilty of murder if we're not careful with our emotions and how we feel about others. How can we learn to manage anger? How can we learn to manage that? We know it can be hurtful, it can be destructive, but knowing this is not enough. It's a powerful, powerful emotion. Just knowing it is not enough. What skills can we develop that will help us manage the problem? What skills can we develop? And how can we turn anger, so it may say righteous anger, righteous indignation, into a productive emotion rather than a destructive one? I think we all recognize what anger is. We feel that feeling welling up inside us. According to the dictionary, they will say it's a strong passion or an emotion of displeasure. Oftentimes involves antagonism. It's against someone else or some situation or something like a lawnmower. It's excited by a sense of injury or insult. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, of what excites anger, what stimulates it, because it's very important to consider why we are stimulated toward anger. But anger is usually almost always, I would say, stimulated by an event or circumstance. We don't just decide to be angry. It's not a decision that we tend to make. It's not something that we generally want to feel. It's usually stimulated by something. We don't wake up and say, well, I'm just going to be angry today. We are responding to something, some kind of frustration, irritation, some kind of pain or displeasure. Perhaps a husband's late for dinner, and that starts out to be a frustration, ends up growing in one's mind until it's a big deal and there's a fight. Perhaps a mother will not let her daughter go out with her friends to a party, and the daughter gets very upset about that. Perhaps a wife may tell her husband she wants him to work around the house today instead of watch football on Sunday. And the husband gets upset because it's interfering with what he wants to do. And so there's frustration. Perhaps a boss asks his employees why they're not getting all their work done, and they're already overworked. It can be very frustrating. We run into frustrating circumstances every day of our life. We run into things that go against what we want, what we plan, what we wish. We run into people who sometimes are rude, and we have many occasions throughout the day to be angry if we're not careful. Unrighteous anger, notice I say unrighteous anger, is the opposite of love. It's the opposite of love. Love draws us closer to one another, but anger sets us against another person. So we have to consider how anger can be very similar to hate, because oftentimes when we get in that mood, we are being antagonistic toward another person. And so it's very similar to hate. It's very much the opposite of love. I want to read to you a quote here about the destructiveness of anger. the destructiveness of anger. Anger, openly displayed, deliberately hidden from others, or unconsciously expressed, is the root of many psychological, interpersonal, physical, and spiritual problems. It has been called the chief saboteur of the mind. The chief saboteur of the mind. And according to Milton Layden, in his book, Escaping the Hostility Trap, anger is the leading cause of misery, depression, sickness, and accidents. How many times have you perhaps been angry at something and did something stupid and caused an accident? It's very common. But anger is one of the leading causes of these things. He goes on to write that no matter what the problem, marital conflict, child defiance, nervous or physical disease, eliminating hostility is a key factor in the solution. I think sometimes we don't think of it that way. We don't think about how, God is love and that leads to life, but hatred and unrighteous anger leads to broken relationships. It ultimately leads to death, and as they have found, it oftentimes even affects us physically. And it really can ruin lives in many ways. And many experts agree with this assessment that Milton Layden puts out there. Anger management is a shockingly underdeveloped skill in this world. We see that sometimes just driving down the freeway. We see anger in so many people. And it's gotten a little better lately because fewer people are on the road, but it's still there. And when the more frustrated people get, the more they will lash out. You'll see people whipping around, driving erratically because they're angry. And so they're setting up an accident, a potential accident waiting to happen. But we do lack the skills to deal properly with anger. And I hope that we in the church, as we are aided by God's Spirit, are able to develop the skills that we need to and to practice them. It takes development and practicing to really make it work. What happens when we get angry? There are certain physiological changes that we're all aware of. The autonomic nervous system pumps adrenaline into our system. It speeds the heart rate, speeds our breathing. That's why one of the techniques that will be used often is to just take slow, deep breaths when we begin to feel frustrated and angry, because we're countering what the body's naturally doing with this adrenaline. It speeds the heart rate, it speeds the breathing, it increases our blood pressure. We tend to become tense and excited. And you imagine being in that state quite a bit of the day, on any given day, and how it could deteriorate the body physically. Certainly the way we feel, our moods, and our relationships. It also gives us a feeling of being overwhelmed, not being in control, unable to control our response. And that's oftentimes when anger gets very destructive and hurtful. Let's ask the question, why do we get angry? Now, I think we could probably list a lot of things that make us frustrated, make us angry. But I think it's an interesting point to bring out, as several experts have. Anger is really a secondary emotion. It's not the primary thing that we feel. Anger usually springs from something else. And to get a handle on anger, we have to really analyze where it springs from. Why am I feeling angry? Usually there's another emotion involved. It may spring from hurt. You've been hurt physically by someone. Maybe it springs from hurt feelings that one has. Maybe it springs from the feeling of rejection, embarrassment, disappointment. Maybe it springs from fear. Anger can also come from guilt. We have a feeling, one of these emotions, and we don't like it, and so we tend to get angry. And it's a response. It's a human response, but one that we have to learn to control. And understanding that it oftentimes is a secondary emotion, there's another emotion that precipitated it to begin with, is an important part of overcoming the problem, if it is a problem, and certainly of managing it. I told a story in the teen podcast. I did a teen podcast on this subject of anger, and it's being posted today. But I told a story to the teens. I told a story of Alan, who, I'll just tell you the story here. He felt himself getting frustrated. His brother had made a joke about the way he threw the baseball. "I don't throw that way," he said. "Shut up." His brother laughed and demonstrated a silly style of throwing the ball that was meant to mimic Alan. And that was it. Alan's anger boiled over. His face grew flushed with blood, and he shouted, "I said stop it! Shut up!" His brother laughed again, and that was too much for Alan. He lunged for his brother, tackling him, and started punching. After a moment of swinging at each other, the brother's dad came out and pulled them apart, sending them to their rooms. When Dad arrived in Alan's room, he told him that he was going to have to learn to control his anger. I talked briefly in the podcast about that, and I mentioned to the young people that it is important to learn to control that emotion when you're young. Because when you get older, the consequences can be much more costly. You get to driving a car and create an accident, and it can be very costly, not only of money, but of people's lives and well-being. So learn to control that early for our young people. Learn to manage that and understand where that comes from. It's very, very important. I'll refer to this story a little bit later, too, of Alan and the situation that he was in and how he might have responded differently. But again, everyone experiences anger. We sometimes express it in different ways. We may be openly hostile to someone. We may exhibit passive-aggressive behavior. We may just hold it inside and seethe and just not say anything about it. But anger is anger. Obviously, certain reactions can be better than others, but it's still there. Even anger held deep inside us and not dealt with can be very, very destructive. So let's ask the question then, is all anger sin? How do we really know the difference? I've talked to people who've been very angry at someone, and they genuinely felt their anger was justified. And from my standpoint, I didn't think it was. But they couldn't understand my standpoint. And so anger can be very deceiving. We can think we have righteous indignation when maybe it's not. How does God see it? And even if it is righteous indignation, how is it affecting us? How is it affecting our relationships? It's a good question. If you turn back to Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 11, we'll read verses 11 and 12. Jeremiah chapter 3. And the Lord said to me, "Backsliding Israel has shown herself more righteous than treacherous Judah. Go and proclaim these words toward the north and say, 'Return, backsliding Israel,' says the Lord, 'and I will not cause my anger to fall on you.'" He was going to cause his anger to fall upon Israel. It says, "For I am merciful, says the Lord. I will not remain angry forever." So here we see an instance where God says that he is going to become angry. Now, that anger won't last forever. And I think that's an interesting quality of God, is he is angry for a genuine positive purpose. In this case, he wanted them to repent. His anger is sometimes, he reaches out to discipline the rebellious. But there is an anger there, he calls it. But it's not destructive. It might physically be destructive at the time, but in the long run, it's meant to bring something positive. Oftentimes, our anger is not the same. Oftentimes, our anger does not produce a positive result. Sometimes we put ourselves in a position of trying to be the punisher of someone who we feel is doing something wrong. And we feel that we can be righteous in doing so, but we're putting ourselves in the position of being the judge and the punisher, when maybe God sees himself as in that place. So we do have to be careful. It also mentions with regards to God's end time judgment on this world just before Christ comes back. In Revelation 19, you don't have to turn there, but he talks about how out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that he should strike the nations. He himself will rule them with a rod of iron. He himself treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of the Almighty God. That's graphic language for God's absolute wrath against people at the end time, because they have been warned to repent and they refuse to do so. And that refusal, that continual refusal, causes God to, as it says, the winepress of the fierceness of the wrath of the Almighty God. But again, what is God's purpose? He's dealing with sin and rebellion. He's certainly just in what he's doing, but his purpose is to humble those people, to humble them, to cause them to be willing to submit and turn to God. And really that's, you might say, a last-ditch effort. It's the last thing he needs to do, that he can do. He's tried all kinds of other means by that time, but the world simply will not repent. Let's go to an example of Jesus Christ in Mark chapter 3. Mark chapter 3 and verse 1. Beginning in 1, we'll read through verse 5. Mark chapter 3 and verse 1. And he entered the synagogue, again, this is Christ, and a man was there who had a withered hand. So they watched him closely, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Step forward." And then he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" Now, according to their own law, their oral law, it was lawful, and they knew it was. But they're not going to speak up. They kept silent. It says, and when he had looked around at them with anger, he had anger in his face. It says, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. And so he did heal him. Now, we see here an example of anger coming from another emotion. He didn't just become angry to be angry. He wasn't angry because they disagreed with him or they were trying to trap him. Notice it says he looked around with anger, being grieved. That's the emotion that precipitated the anger, was grief. He was grieved by the hardness of their hearts. It wasn't anything that they were doing to him. He wasn't grieved because they were trying to entrap him. He was grieved because they were so hard-hearted they couldn't even have compassion toward this man with a withered hand. They, according to their own oral law, should have allowed for the healing, but they refused. They refused to see it that way because they didn't want Christ getting the attention that he was. They wanted to accuse him. And so their hard-heartedness did not allow them to even abide by their own law. And so he was grieved by that. And so we see here another example of Christ being angry, but he didn't sin. His anger was actually because of the sinful attitudes that those Jewish leaders were exhibiting, and unable to feel compassion and love. Now, we can exhibit righteous anger. It's possible. But, I find most often, and myself and others, it's rare. It really is. And oftentimes when we think that we're justified in our anger, it's good to take a step back and say, well, maybe I'm not. Maybe I think I am, but maybe I'm not. Because as I said, most often we are not. It's hard to exercise righteous anger in these human fleshly bodies with the human nature that we fight against. Now, it's possible with the help of God's Spirit. But for a person who's exercising righteous anger, they will find that they're not angry very often. And we'll talk about some of the criteria here. One of the chief criteria that we find, Christ exhibited himself. We can become angry because of sin, the sin of someone else. We can identify it as righteous anger. But usually it's because someone sinned against me. That's really at the core of why I'm angry. I can think it's because of the sin. I can say it's because of the sin. But if I really look deep down inside, it's because it's against me. I don't want them to sin. I don't want them to sin against anyone. But because it's against me, it becomes all the more powerful, all the more hurtful. And if it's hurtful, that hurt may be the emotion that generates anger. It can come in a variety of ways. But usually it's something that's against us. It's interesting that Christ said this. He says, anyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man, speaking of himself, it will be forgiven him. His attitude was, I don't care what you say to me, okay, you can be forgiven of that. It says, but whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit, it will not be forgiven him, either in this age or the age to come. We can blaspheme God and his power, his mind, his plan. We can knowingly do that, and they could knowingly do that. And he says that's a different story. That's a whole different story. But me, I'm not so concerned about that. If you remember in Luke 23, verse 34, as he's being crucified, he doesn't lash out at those who are hurting him. He doesn't lash out because they're casting lots for his garments. He doesn't say, hey, those are mine. What are you doing? So he doesn't lash out because they struck him. They spit on him. He said these words. He said, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It was never about him. No, it was never about how he was treated. They sinned. They sinned against Christ. Absolutely. And he asked for them to be forgiven. Now, that's a powerful example, isn't it? If anyone were to treat any of us the way they treated Christ, it would be hard not to lash out, hard not to be angry with them. I can't imagine that, really. When think about it in your own life. Someone comes up and spits in your face, starts hitting you, hurting you. How do you keep that emotion down? Well, Christ did it because it wasn't about him. It was about the plan of God. And of course, this was a very unique circumstance. His crucifixion had to happen for our sakes. But we really don't see him acting that way at any time in his life where he just becomes angry because of selfishness. His anger was always because of the unrighteousness of others. It wasn't about being, when they did something unrighteous to him, he didn't get angry and lash back. That wasn't the example he set. But again, that's very hard. So we have to consider that the anger that we feel typically is wrong anger. Even if we are acting because of someone else's wrongdoing, it's oftentimes because they have wronged us or someone close to us. And that is precipitating that anger. So it's important to consider that. God's anger comes from two qualities. First of all, his holiness. God is holy. It says in 1 Peter 1:16, be holy, for I am holy. And it's an interesting challenge to be holy, for God is holy. Certainly, our attitude and how we control our anger is a big part of our holiness, whether we can truly be holy as he is holy. The second attribute that comes from in God is his love. His love, concern, and compassion for others. Of course, God sees the terrible effects of sin. I think he sees sin so much worse than even we do. He sees where it leads, and he's seen it all this time. He sees it in Satan and where it led Satan. Any sin is terrible, and God sees it. So it stirs him to try to help that person. And sometimes that help comes in humbling them, helping to see their wrongdoing. So anger that is truly generated from holiness and love is not sin. Problem is, again, we're not God. We're not Christ. Therefore, we cannot fully know if our own anger comes purely from those qualities and nothing else. It's very easy to deceive ourselves. And so my recommendation in my own life and anyone else's is to assume that it's anger that we need to deal with. I'm not saying it's impossible to have righteous anger when we're led by God's Spirit, but I think it's always good to really analyze it and see if we're not motivated by a more selfish cause. Righteous anger should lead us to take positive, constructive action. Even if we're correcting an injustice or correcting unrighteousness, it should lead us to take positive, constructive action. Now, we may think that our anger is justified because of a wickedness, a genuine sin. But does it produce a positive result? Is it constructive? Is it helping the situation? Again, we're not God. We can't just put ourselves in the position of discipline other people. And we have, as parents, the responsibility of disciplining our children. But even that should be done in love, not anger. Sometimes it's important for a parent to back away, send the child to their room, cool off, and then discipline our children in whatever way is appropriate for the occasion. But discipline should never be done in anger. We're not God. We make mistakes. We don't have the same judgment as Him. And oftentimes when we're angry, we can make wrong assumptions and make really bad mistakes. Again, our idea of what's right and wrong can be skewed. We may think we're being sinned against. And oftentimes that's the case. A man blows at you at the stoplight because you're 1 second too late in moving forward. And of course, you look at that guy behind you and think how rude that is. Well, it is rude. How unloving that is. And you can get yourself worked up about his problem, but really, do you have to respond that way? Is it really productive? Is it helpful for you or anyone else in the car with you? It really isn't. Even though that man, you can make the case that he sinned, he was rude and uncaring. What about a husband who comes home late for dinner? Well, that's not right. That's not considerate. No, maybe it's not. But is it a cause for anger because of that lack of consideration? Is it really a cause for anger? Usually it's because we feel hurt by the other person's action. What about the mom who won't let the daughter go out with friends? Her daughter thinks, well, this isn't right. I should be able to. I see no problem. This isn't right. And the daughter can easily think that her anger is justified because mom's wrong. See, it's easy for us to consider something to be right or righteous when in reality maybe it's not. Or maybe it's not something we ought to be getting ourselves worked up over. And so it's important to consider it's easy to deceive ourselves in terms of what's right and what's wrong. Satan takes what should be a righteous response to genuine wrong, that is righteous anger, and he twists it into a selfish, counterproductive violence against someone else. Whether it's verbal violence or physical violence. Satan twists what, we ought to be able to respond in a righteous way and have righteous indignation, but Satan's very quick to get in there and to twist it and cause us to be deceived about it. Again, righteous anger should lead us to take positive, constructive action to correct injustice or unrighteousness. And our actions must be motivated by love, not out of what's been done to us or to a friend or a family member. The problem is that anger becomes a raging, uncontrollable force in some people, a demonstration of contempt for other people. It's destructive to ourselves and to others. Let's look at a few scriptural examples here. If you go back to Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 31, Ephesians 4 and verse 31. The Apostle Paul warns us here and challenges us, really. He says in Ephesians 4, verse 31, let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. This is quite a challenge. Again, we can say, well, I have a righteous anger. But where's that leading us? How's it making us feel? How's it making us respond to others? He says that all bitterness. I've known people over the years who have been bitter, and they hold on to that bitterness, and they're justified in holding on to that bitterness. And it is literally eating them up. It's their focus. They can't get away from it. They don't realize that they're poisoning themselves. I think that's part of why he says here, let all of this, all bitterness, wrath, and anger, clamor, evil speaking, be put away. It doesn't produce good. At least typically it doesn't. Rarely does it. If you go back to Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 9, Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 9, it says in Ecclesiastes 7:9, do not hasten in your spirit to be angry. Some people do that. They're quick to be angry. That's their go-to emotion when something's bothered them. Their go-to. And they've trained themselves to respond that way. They don't even have to think about it. It's just a trained impulse. It says, do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Powerful warning there. No matter how justified we think our anger may be, anger rests in the bosom of fools. And so we should want to put it away. I'm sure that you know that anger is one of the works of the flesh mentioned by Paul in Galatians 5. He mentions that in verse 19. Now the works of the flesh are self-evident. And one of those is outbursts of wrath. Again, I'm sure the person who's bursting forth in wrath considers themselves perfectly justified in what they do. But that is one of the works of the flesh. Think about anger and how opposite it is to so many of the fruits of the Spirit. I'll read to you them here, verse 22 of Galatians 5. But the fruit of the Spirit is love. Does anger mesh with love? Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Think about how anger causes us to act in opposition to so many of these fruits of the Spirit. It's opposition of love. We don't feel joy when we're angry. We don't have peace when we're angry. We're not exhibiting long-suffering when we're angry. We're not acting kindly when we're angry. We certainly oftentimes aren't being gentle in our words or actions. And we're not exhibiting self-control. Oftentimes, I realize that a person can be angry and exercise self-control, but others have a real hard time controlling themselves when they really get angry. Anger causes us to act in opposition to many of the fruits of the Spirit, and that's one of the reasons it can be so damaging mentally, physically, and spiritually. So let's talk about some practical steps then. Practical steps to manage anger. Some of the skills, you might say. And I realize there are a number of lists and things that could be included in a practical way to something like this. As I mentioned earlier, taking deep breaths, that's one of them that I'm not really, isn't on my list. But I think the list I have is something that can be helpful at least as you think about managing anger. Skills that can help us control and direct our emotions. Number one is to recognize when we're becoming angry, to actually sense it and to identify it. A lot of people just let it happen. It's natural. They go there, and they don't, in their mind, think about what's happening. It's just a go-to. It's important to recognize when we're becoming angry. In my podcast to the teens, I talked about monitoring our anger thermostat. How hot is it becoming? I mentioned to them, maybe if you're in a situation it's lower than 5, that's okay. But you start letting it get up to 6, 7, 8, oftentimes it will go to 10. And I found that expression to monitor your anger thermometer. And that can be very helpful. We have to recognize when we start to get angry. And because if we don't recognize it when it's beginning, there's no way we're going to stop it. We're not going to act rationally. We're just going to let it happen. So recognize the need to monitor that anger. It was funny. I'll tell a story on myself. Last week, I was working on a sermon topic, and I could tell my wife didn't think it was a very good topic. And so I began to wonder myself, but I thought I might be able to pull it off. But then I decided to go this direction, a totally different topic. And I went excitedly, announced to my wife that I'm going to talk about managing our anger. And I'm excited. I think it's a useful topic considering the circumstances. She looked over at me and said, "Really? Don't you think you should do something more encouraging?" And I started to defend the topic. I think it's good for this, what we're going through, and people we see in the news, people are losing their temper, getting violent sometimes in their families, and I think it's a valid topic. Well, it didn't convince her. And so I started to feel that frustration that this kind of is hurtful to me, I expected her to be, that's a great topic, Gary, but it didn't come. So I'm starting to feel kind of hurt and wondering, well, what am I going to do if I have to come up with something different? And so I started getting a little concerned or fearful that maybe this isn't going to work like I thought. And so I started getting frustrated. Now, I didn't get angry, thankfully, but I noticed, and Gail and I laughed about the fact that I responded that way. I started to get frustrated. Even though I'm about to give a sermon on monitoring your frustration, anger, I'm letting myself go there because I'm feeling a little hurt by this. Now, again, thankfully, we caught it, we laughed about it, but how easy that is. I know I shouldn't get angry and I shouldn't let things frustrate me to that degree, but it's just human nature to kind of go down that path when we start having these other emotions. If we feel hurt, if we feel ignored, whatever the emotion is, oftentimes it starts and transforms into anger. And so it was funny how that was happening. Thankfully, I was able to practice the point number 1 and recognize it was happening. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26 says, "Be angry and sin not. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down in your wrath, nor give place to the devil." If we don't catch it, if we don't monitor our feelings, if we don't monitor our anger, then we give place to Satan. He can influence us to get even more angry. He can blow it out of proportion. It is a way for Satan to get into our mind, you might say, to influence us, to cause us to overreact. We must not give place to the devil. And being angry is one of those ways that we certainly do that. Second point then, to immediately restrain our response. Now, if we have to recognize we're getting angry, but first of all, that has to happen. But secondly, restrain ourselves immediately. Recognize that the path I'm going down is probably going to be negative. Now, again, this takes practice because the mind tends to do what it does naturally. We have to think about it. We have to make ourselves. That's why monitoring is so important. Monitor that anger thermostat. We see it rising, immediately restrain whatever action is we're thinking about doing. Whatever it is we're about to say, don't say it. Whatever it is we're about to do, don't do it. Just restrain ourselves. Proverbs 29, verse 11, says that a fool vents all his feelings. Proverbs 29, verse 11. A fool vents all his feelings, but a wise man holds them back. Now, you may feel a certain way. We may feel ourselves getting agitated, frustrated, and even angry. But we have to hold back. We have to deal with that. Now, I'm not saying over the long term just suppressing anger. I'm talking about that initial reaction when we're feeling it in the moment. Proverbs 14, verse 17. Proverbs 14, verse 17 says, "A quick-tempered man acts foolishly." So we don't want to quickly express what we're feeling. We want to restrain whatever response we're going to have. And this requires really unlearning old patterns, because typically we don't monitor our anger, we just respond. And so we have to unlearn these old patterns. I read a quote that I thought was interesting. It said, "Speak when you are angry, and you'll make the best speech you'll ever regret." I like that. Speak when you're angry, and you'll make the best speech you'll ever regret. And how many times do we find that to be the case? You can restrain yourself. You can do it if you don't start expressing that anger. Once you start expressing it, it's harder to restrain yourself. And so that really is the time, early on, when you're monitoring your emotion, and that's the time to catch yourself. So do it early. You might need to actually say, I'm getting frustrated. I need to think about how to respond right now. It may be something you say. I don't want to ignore this, but I'm feeling frustrated. I need to think about how I want to respond. Please excuse me for a moment. Nothing wrong with that, because that leads us to point number 3, is identify our underlying emotion. What is causing us? What's really causing the anger? Identifying that underlying reason helps us think through what's really happening in our minds, what's really going on. Ask ourselves, what is happening to make me feel this way? What's going on? Why am I feeling this way? For me, I recognized that I thought that Gail would be as excited about the topic as I was. And she said, we need to do something encouraging. I did tell her this. I said, well, I'm going to encourage people to manage anger well. And so that's how this is encouraging. We're encouraging you to manage anger well. So I'm sure she's smiling right now. But at any rate, I had to recognize, what am I starting to feel? And I realized that I'm kind of hurt that she didn't feel the same way I did about it. I'm fearful about having to choose another topic and what it might be. I feel good about this being relevant now. And so, you have to analyze that. If you go back to the story I told that I mentioned in the teen podcast, Alan and throwing the ball and being made fun of about how he throws the ball. Imagine being in his spot. How would you feel if your brother starts mimicking you and throwing in a silly way? Well, it is hurtful. Maybe he felt embarrassed about it. And, that feeling you feel for a split second or maybe a second or two, you're feeling hurt, but then it changes, doesn't it? Now you want to lash out because of the way that person made you feel. Anger is not where it started. It started with Alan's hurt and his embarrassment that he was feeling. And he had to protect himself. He had to protect that himself in that way and not allow this person to cause these feelings. Now, we'll talk in a little bit about some constructive ways that he could have responded. But sometimes it means we have to ask God to help us see ourselves. God sees us perfectly. Sometimes we need to ask God in prayer, help me see why, what's causing this. Help me understand my heart better. Help me understand the way I think better. But we have to monitor our anger, and we have to immediately step back and not respond the way we wanted to, and think about what is the real cause. What is causing me to feel this way? That's point number 3. Point number 4 is consider your response options. Consider your response options. Now, I do think that the more we train ourselves to do this type of thing, the quicker this can happen. I think as we're learning to consider our response options, perhaps we think there, scratch our head and think, well, the only thing I've got is anger. It's the only thing I've known. This is my natural. It's where I go. It's what I feel. And perhaps it's hard to think up other options. Sometimes it's easier to do this if we do it when we're not in the heat of the moment. Think about how maybe we see someone else who's angry, and if I were in that person's shoes, how might I think of some other options as to how to deal with this? If I'm feeling hurt, as this person maybe over here is, in other words, it's not you that's feeling, someone else is, and you can more rationally think through what's a better response. That way, when I'm in the position and I see that anger thermometer rising, I can stop, I can analyze why I feel this way, and I can consider a better response. It's a lot easier to do it when you practice it, considering other people and what they are going through. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 28. Proverbs 15 and verse 28 really tells us to do this exact thing, to consider our response options. We don't have to respond by being angry. There are other options, especially when we identify the real reason that we're becoming angry. Proverbs 15, verse 28 says, "The heart of the righteous studies how to answer." Studies how to answer. "But the mouth of the wicked pours forth evil." And that's what oftentimes happens when we just allow ourselves to get angry, is we're pouring forth that which is not helpful, that which is unproductive, that which destroys, that hurts relationships, causes problems. The heart of the wicked just pours it forth, lets it go, no control. But the heart of the righteous studies how to answer. So there is a studying in our mind, a considering what's the best approach. If I'm going to respond in a loving and productive way, what is the best approach for me to take? Now again, this takes self-control, doesn't it? And that's where God's Spirit can help us. But we can analyze. Another thing to think about is how serious is this offense? Really, how serious is it? We hear stories of people losing their temper. The little child's crying and gets slapped. Is crying really that bad? I mean, is it that serious of an offense? I mean, a child perhaps dumps Coke on the table, spills their milk, as the old expression goes. How serious is that? We take a step back and analyze, is this really something that I should get angry at? Is my response going to be an over exaggeration of what's needed and what's appropriate? We should differentiate major offenses from minor ones, and that'll come into play as we conclude here a little bit more. Differentiate major offenses from minor irritations, and make sure that our response is measured, a measured response. Let's go back to the story of Alan and the way he's throwing the ball and being made fun of. His brothers mocking him and twisting, gyrating, and making all kinds of silly throwing motions. What could Alan do? Or other responses? What could he have done that might have been more productive? He felt hurt. He felt that he needed to defend his pride. And so he yells at his brother and gets angrier and angrier and then attacks his brother. What's a more constructive response? Well, one thing he could do is just be open and say, hey, I don't like the way you're making me feel. I'm just going to go inside. And, you're acting in ways making me feel hurt. I'm just going to go inside. But he had to recognize where that anger was coming from. And it was coming from hurt or embarrassment. He could have just said, I'm not feeling I want to stay here. This isn't making me respond very well, or I'm not enjoying it, and just go inside. Maybe a little bit later, his brother comes and says, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. Let's go play. Maybe it works out. Another thing that Alan could have done, if he had thought about it, is here's his brother being playful, laughing, having a good time. Yes, it's at Alan's expense, but he's having a good time. Alan could have just joined him, started making silly throwing motions himself and laughing, and they could just pretend to do silly pitch, if you will. But whatever the case, he could have just joined in the fun and mocked himself a little bit too. But that would take a swallowing of the pride, wouldn't it? But had he done that, they could have both enjoyed playing and laughing together. We shouldn't always assume that someone's trying to hurt us, trying to embarrass us. No, sometimes they may be, but oftentimes we can jump to that conclusion and then lash out at them. So there are several things that Alan could have done. Maybe you can think of some others, but those would have been much better responses than what he did. Just to go straight to anger and to lose control. Again, a righteous response is that which should lead to a positive, constructive conclusion. It is truly love in action, even if it's against an injustice or perceived injustice or unrighteousness. Ask ourselves the question, will the action I take be constructive or destructive? Will it improve the relationship or save the relationship? How will it help? Now, this takes, again, taking a step back from anger, because anger is oftentimes irrational. And sometimes we get angry, we actually don't want to be rational. And we have to deal with that. That is not a good place to be in, to put ourselves in a position where I don't care about acting in a righteous way. That's dangerous. I don't care what God thinks about how I respond. That's a real dangerous place to put ourselves in. So it really does behoove us to want to respond in the right way and not let anger, not give place to the devil, where we actually have an attitude of, I don't care about God, this person, or how I should act. And oftentimes that's where anger leads us. Ultimately we have a couple of ultimate options. There are many things, many ways that we could respond, but ultimately there's two. One is to simply choose to overlook a matter. We may choose not to respond at all, to overlook a matter. Proverbs 19, verse 11. Maybe the person who blew their horn at us, right when the light turned green. Perhaps it's best just to let that one go, especially in Texas when you don't know what they're carrying in the car with them. But I say that in jest, but it is sometimes better not to get into a fighting match or see who can do something to the other person on the road, who can cut them off or whatever. It can get rather dangerous. But Proverbs 19, verse 11 says, "The discretion of a man makes him slow to anger." The discretion of a man makes him slow to anger, and his glory is to overlook a transgression. You ever thought about that? It's a glorious thing to be able to overlook something, especially when it's minor, to just overlook it, to not let it, and that means really overlooking it, not letting it seethe inside us, not letting it continue to irritate us. It's not storing up that anger, but it's truly forgiving and overlooking it. Sometimes we just simply have to turn it over to God. Let God be the judge. Let God be the one who deals with this person and how they're acting and what they've done to me. I think it's just better to let God handle it and turn it over to God's hands. It says in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 7, you don't have to turn there, but 1 Corinthians 6 verse 7, Paul writes to the brethren in Corinth and says, "Now therefore it's already an utter failure that you go to law against the other." They're getting upset and going and filing a lawsuit. It says, "Why do you not rather accept wrong?" Now, are we the kind of person that can accept wrong? You know, some personalities, some people have a difficult time letting any kind of wrong go. You know, that chafes the pride, and they can't let anything go. But he says, why don't you rather accept wrong? Sometimes the righteous thing to do is accept wrong. Christ certainly accepted a lot of wrong against him. He goes on to say in 1 Corinthians 6, 7, "Why do you not rather let yourselves be cheated?" Wow. Who can do that? I mean, that takes some of God's Spirit, doesn't it? To allow ourselves to be taken advantage of. Sometimes that's exactly the right thing to do. Because oftentimes when we're in that place where we feel taken advantage of, we're just going to lash out to preserve our pride. And oftentimes what we do, even though we feel justified, it's just because of our own pride. It's okay. It's okay to accept wrong. It's okay in some circumstances to let ourselves, quote, be cheated. And maybe a person borrowed from us, didn't pay it back. I mean, you know, we can get upset and angry about that. But sometimes it's better just to leave it in God's hands. Let God deal with the situation. But that's one of the options that we have is to just overlook and not let it bother us, to forgive. And oftentimes this is oftentimes the case when it's a temporary, incidental thing. But if it's something that continues to be a problem, that we have a relationship with this person, we see them often, this happens often, I feel this way often, then in that case, we're probably going to have to address it rather than overlook it. And the key there, point number 2 here, is the second ultimate way of dealing with the problem is to calmly address the person about the issue. Calmly. That takes self-control. We all know the proverb in Proverbs 15:1. It says, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stirs up anger." And we really ought to take that to heart. If we don't want to cause another person to be angry, and us join them in that anger, then we want to use a soft answer. And it is amazing as we consider our options, how to respond to people. Consider Proverbs 15. A soft answer turns away wrath. It can do amazing things when we react in a calm way. Mr. Meeker last night on his Friday Night Live discussed Matthew 18 and going to our brother. Had some very good practical advice on doing that. And sometimes that's what we need to do at this point. Rather than getting angry, letting it seethe inside us and get more and more frustrated, just calmly go to our brother, practice what it says in Matthew 19, and deal with it. But again, a lot of things can simply be overlooked. They're not worth our emotional energy in dealing with. So a person who has a serious temper problem, a serious anger problem, really should seek help, seek counsel. and further study the issue. I mentioned to the teens in the podcast, they can go to Life, Hope, and Truth and type in anger, and there are a number of articles dealing with the subject of anger. But study it, seek counsel, ask God for help if we have a real serious problem in that regard. It takes more than wishing we could overcome. If we're going to deal with anger, it takes more than wishing, because it's a pathway in our mind that we have practiced, that we have become accustomed to. It's a habit. We oftentimes go to anger, and it takes commitment. It really takes a commitment to overcome and to deal with and to manage anger, especially for some people who tend to respond and lash out very easily. It really takes commitment and help from God. More often, our human anger is the result of selfishness and pride. Most often that's the case. It comes from something selfish or prideful. And so we have to step back and humble ourselves if we're not going to act in an unrighteous way. Righteous anger is a quality that God does express, and one that we should learn to express in a godly way. Godly anger is a constructive, positive, ultimately loving response to injustice and sin. Remember what it says in Proverbs 16, verse 32. Proverbs 16:32, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty. He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty. He who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. Sometimes it's easy. Our human nature can tell us that if we're going to be mighty, if we're going to be strong, then we're going to defend ourselves. We're going to defend our pride. We're not going to allow ourselves to be hurt and not lash back. Our human nature says that we're being a big person. We're being powerful. But in reality, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty. If we can control our anger, that's a better thing to do than to go to war and to be known as a great warrior. That war that takes place in the mind and the heart is more important than that which showing ourselves to be mighty in an outward way. Again, to rule our spirit is better than he who takes a city. It is powerful. It is strong to rule ourselves. It is a display of power to not get angry. Satan doesn't want us to feel that way about it, but it truly is. And hopefully this message today, brethren, can get us thinking about the problem and how easily it can beset us, how it is one of those things that Satan tries to get an inroad to us by becoming angry. Anger can be a powerful thing used in a good way, but it oftentimes is a very destructive thing used in a bad way. So I would like to conclude by saying, I hope that you are more encouraged to deal effectively with anger.